All right, we are going to look at books 7 and 8, but I'm going to use books 7 and 8 of Paradise Lost to talk about space and time in Paradise Lost, which is a topic that I have spoken to at least obliquely so far, but I haven't addressed it directly. And I wanted to do that and take a whole lecture to do it because it's quite significant in the poem, and I think it's also something that's rather easy to overlook. So it's worth taking the time to get a sense of how Milton's universe is entirely orderly, and it's the order reflects the themes of the poem, which is all the more extraordinary when you think of the context that he was blind and dictated the poem to his daughter. But I think at the end of the lecture you will have a sense of the grandeur of the whole vision of Milton in Paradise Lost, and maybe why it took him so long to come to compose it. This picture, by the way, is it's on the website, so if you can't get it with that, you'll find it as a image there on our course website. But so the time and place schema of Paradise Lost is really an extension of its themes, and it amplifies the themes, and that's what I'm going to try and demonstrate today. But it's certainly been the case that this structure that I'm going to talk about has not been seen by critics, or it has been disputed that it does have that sort of structure, and I think the case was made very admirably by Alistair Fowler in the second edition of the Longman annotated version of Paradise Lost, where I first read it, and I'm convinced by it. I think it's terrific stuff. And whoever said that editors don't make genuine contributions, this is certainly one. So this is a work of great scholarship, I think, in drawing together the picture that I'm going to present. So the question is of the sense of time. First of all, let me talk about that. And days. As I say, the time scheme of Paradise Lost sets out the thematic ideas of the goodness of creation, the magnitude of sin and death, and the redemptive power of God in restoring what is lost. One of the challenges that is going to arise about this is when we come to look at days on the page here that we have days. We have 33 of them. The days that Milton reckons are not days, 24-hour days. They're reckoned in accordance with a Hebrew understanding of a biblical understanding of a day spanning from evening to evening. There was evening and there was morning the first day. So it begins in the evening. And the evening doesn't begin at 12 p.m. or 12 midnight. It begins when the sun has not yet set. So when the sun rises, the day began in what we would call the night. So that's part of the confusion. Second part of the confusion is when he's talking about days in heaven. I'll come to this more closely later on. He is using, and I talked about this last class, he's using accommodationist language. He explicitly states that this is presented even to an unfallen Adam. I am presenting it in ways that you will be able to understand it. So the 3 days of the war in heaven are not to be understood in terms of terrestrial days per se, but we're using that for the sake of your understanding. Let's talk about it in such terms. So there's complexity to the whole picture. Nonetheless, this picture behind me, I think, governs the discussion. And what we're going to see is that the heavenly and the hellish action comprises 13 days. The creation takes 7 days, and then the terrestrial action takes 13 days again. 13, 7, 13. Altogether, 33. And you'll remember, and I'll come back to this, Dante's Divine Comedy was divided in its canticles in the same way. So the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso all had 33 cantos in them. So that was the structure of it. Now there was 100 because the first canto of the Inferno was a sort of a introduction to it, and so that made up 100, which is also numerologically significant. And by the way, Milton, in presenting things where time and space are so rationally ordered and important, is just a child of his age. They thought that numbers were very significant in Scripture. And the Church Fathers most certainly did. And it's part of the patterning or the ordering of the created order, is that it can be understood very clearly without contradiction in accordance with number. It was something that Pythagoras proposed as well, what Plato certainly believed. Plato said above the academy that one could not enter without understanding geometry. Geometry, which is the way in which the earth is measured, literally. So mathematics and the reasoning by virtue of number is essential to Milton's project. And think of the 7 liberal arts. We know about the trivium, the grammar, the logic, the rhetoric. These are the verbal arts. But the 4 other arts, the arithmetic and geometry and astronomy and got the 4th. These are the so-called sciences. And so the arts and the sciences, the 7 are the arts, and they comprise the entirety of knowledge. And when I say knowledge, it's not speculation. It's clear, distinct, and entirely coherent knowledge forms, which is fractured, by the way, when Galileo with his telescope demonstrates the theory of Copernicus that the theory of astronomy cannot be true. And Descartes begins his method of doubt, and I think it's largely a response to Galileo's discoveries. Because he was certain of many things, and above all the things he was certain of was the fact that the heavens are the way they are. Because that ordered everything. Everything was certain. And now it's been thrown into absolute doubt, and so he begins the method of doubt. What can I be certain of then? I can't be certain of the stars and the constellations of the planets. I can be certain of the fact that I'm thinking, or rather certain of the fact that I'm doubting, which means that I'm thinking, which means that I exist. And therefore, I think, therefore I am. But the method of doubt to establish certainty, but you begin with doubt. So it's, in a sense, it's the antithesis to the method of certitude that had reigned before that. I begin with a belief that I can know. Now, I don't begin with doubt. I believe, I credo ut intelligam. I believe in order to understand. Now I'm going to doubt in order that I might understand, and then bring in the scientific method, empiricist proof, so I can demonstrate it with certainty with my own senses, and everyone else can repeat the experiments. That's how I will gain certainty, but I begin with the premise of doubt. Whereas before that, it was from the premise of certainty on the basis of what one can observe in nature, in mathematics, mathematical knowledge. Oh, I forgot music. Mathematical knowledge, music, astronomy, and geometry. These are the 4 ways of knowing the world around us mathematically. But we can be certain of it. It's real knowledge, and there's no doubt about it. So the big shift in this period results in Milton's great poem, but he's not going to be building it on doubt. So I'll come to that in a second. So Milton's time scheme is uncertain for a few reasons, and one of them is because of what he means by day. But he did follow clearly Jerome, the church father, author of the Latin Vulgate Bible, who reckoned that sunset was the beginning of the day. So evening arose in Eden, for the sun was set, it says in book 7 here, line 582 and following. So now, Paradise Lost divides in terms of a calendar into biblical days, thereby consisting of an evening followed by a morning. Now you can also look at it in terms of 24-hour days, but so there's a little ambiguity there. And one of the ambiguities is we'll see this later, and you might just want to write this down and look up what's being meant here. In Book 10, 773 and following, Adam has been told, on the day in which you eat of this tree, you will die. And he doesn't die. It's not instant, but he's wondering about the day, the time scheme now. So there's a certain uncertainty now. That's one of the consequences of the fall, by the way, is that the orderly cosmos that Milton projects is changed by the fall itself. So the creation that was once entirely orderly and mathematically precise now starts to show breaches. And understanding falls from that as well. Adam's understanding of the order of things. And that's because the order of things is actually changed. So it's not just Adam sins and he falls, but the whole creation is fragmented by it. Adam can't control himself anymore. He used to rationally control and will that his passions did a certain thing. Now his passions overthrow his reason. And he does things that he didn't want to do. Just like the Apostle Paul talks about this. The thing that I didn't want to do, that's the thing I kept on doing. The thing that I wanted to do, I didn't do that. Here's a problem. He can't even control himself. Adam suffers from the same thing, but before he was perfectly self-controlled. And the order of the cosmos was also controlled, but it goes in different directions. So there's a bit of that. So as far as the time scheme, so up on the overhead here, and as I said, on our course website, so you don't have to write all this down if you don't want to. There is a reckoning of the different days, and as I say, the general pattern is that in heaven and hell, the action takes 13 days, creation takes 7 days, and the terrestrial action takes 7 days. But I said that these days have a thematic pattern, and they amplify the themes of the epic as a whole. So let me talk about that. The terrestrial action that is spoken of here at the end there occupies books 4 to 10. 7 books. 13 days. 7 books. 7 books, the number 7 is the number of earthly completion. It's the number of the world, it's the number of creation. God creates everything in 6 days. On the 7th he rested, so it's 7 days. So it's complete. So that's the first point. Books 4 to 10 that is 7 books reflect 13 days. But there's a completedness to it. Of these 7 days, the central is that described in book 7, which we were looking at for our reading today, which recounts creation and discusses the system of the 7 planets. Note the number 7. And so the 4th day and the central day of the 7th day, the 4th of 7 right in the middle, day 17 of the 33, so right in the middle of the 33 days that he describes, is also the central day of the poem's action. On that day, this is the 4th point, so the first point is that there are the 7 books of terrestrial action are a reflection of the number of earthly completion and of creation. First point. Second point, of those 7 days, the central one is the 4th day, and it's described in book 7, interestingly, again the 7. And that recounts creation and discusses the 7 planets. So in other words, it's talking about the earth and the celestial spheres, the planets that are set in them, and the 7 liberal arts that will be then mirroring those things. Thirdly, the central of those days, the fourth day, the day of creation, is day 17, so it's right in the middle of the whole 33 days depicted in Paradise Lost. And on that day, day 17th, the fourth day of creation, the sun is created. I've heard people mockingly said the sun comes after light. What's with that? Right? There, God creates, day and night and the light. So there's a day, but there's no sun yet. What's going on with this? But needs to be read in a thematic way, and it needs to be read in a rather different, more nuanced way than simply then this, then this, then this. It's not meant to be read as a chronological sequence only. So the sun is created on the fourth day, and the central place of the sun in the whole epic is discussed in Book 8, line 123 and following. Let me read that to you. 8, line 123. What if the sun be center to the world, and other stars by his attractive virtue and their own incited dance around about him various rounds, their wandering course now high, now low, then hid, progressive, retrograde, or standing still, in 6 thou seest, and what if 7th to these, the planet Earth, so steadfast though she seem, insensibly 3 different motions move, while else to several spheres thou must ascribe moved contrary with thwart obliquities, gosh, sorry about that, or save the sun his labor, and that the swift nocturnal and diurnal rom supposed, invisible else above all stars, the wheel of day and night. So he posits there, Raphael, in a lengthy paragraph, it continues on, that the sun may occupy a central space. Now this, in the cosmology of Galileo, that would be the case. It's the heliocentric universe. Remember, the cosmology that would have been the one that the church said was the official, this is the one that we think is the correct one, is the Ptolemaic cosmology, in which the Earth is at the center. And then there are concentric spheres around it, and they move in and there's a perfection to those spheres, and the planet's stuck in those constellations. But what if this? We're going to find, by the way, that Milton presents his own cosmology and literally his own cosmology, in which the heliocentric and the geocentric views are united. Now he's talking about an unfallen world, but that's what he's describing in Paradise Lost. This is the way it was. So the sun is on the fourth day, in the middle of the 7. And on that 7th day, book 7, line 386, the day is said to be crowned by the sun. So the sun is the king of the whole of the created order in one sense. Now remember what Milton has said in his invocation in book 3 about light. And what Satan says when he sees the light and sees it as a picture or as a representation of the Son of God, but as a pale shadow, as a type of God, as it were. So Satan recognizes the symbolic significance of the sun and sees in that the reign of the sun something of the reign of the Son of God, and he despises it and hates it for that resemblance. But everything reminds him of God's sovereign rule over all things and his goodness, and he loathes that. Fifthly, the directly represented terrestrial action is actually only 11 days, so days 23 to 33. That's 11 days. So there are 33 or 13 days of terrestrial action, but they're only directly represented on 11. Why? Nobody's going to guess it, because I wouldn't have guessed it. You'd have to know. One of the things about Milton is people have ideas about what he might have meant. Their imaginations run wild, and they think, I can come up with a clever solution. But Milton doesn't speculate. You would have got this from Augustine. This is also, by the way, on the course webpage. If you but in whatever manner the generations of Cain's line are traced downwards, whether it be by firstborn sons or by the heirs to the throne, it seems to me that I must by no means omit to notice that when Lamech had been set down as the seventh from Adam, there were named in addition as many of his children as made up this number to 11, which is the number signifying sin. For 3 sons and 1 daughter are added. The wives of Lamech have another signification different from that which I am now pressing. For at present I am speaking of the children, and not of those by whom the children were begotten. Since then the law is symbolized by the number 10. Whence that memorable decalogue, there is no doubt that the number 11, which goes beyond 10, symbolizes the transgression of the law, and consequently sin, for this reason, etc., etc. So 11 is the number of sin. Transgressing, adding to God's law, the sole prohibition. I can add one more. So he portrays 11 days of action. Even though there are 13, he only portrays 11. Why? Because this is an account of sin and how it enters the world. Again, it reinforces the themes, the account of paradise lost. Sixthly, the ratio of the represented to narrated action is 1 to 2, 11 to 22. 22 of the days are narrated, 11 of them are directly represented. So we're told about only 11 of, or we're narrated that there are 22 other days, but we see 11 days of action, and the ratio is then 1 to 2. This ratio is also the spatial disposition of the universe. Book 1, lines 73 and 74. Let me look at this. I'll just read it to you. Because I said this is about space and time, I just want to show the connection between time and space here. So this is describing hell. For those rebellious here, their prison ordained in utter darkness, and their portion set as far removed from God and light of heaven as from the center thrice to the utmost pole. This is a ratio of 1 to 2. And it signifies the harmony of reason controlling lust, concupiscence. So in other words, although there's a fall and a sin that takes place, God is sovereign and in control of it, and his divinely ordered rational universe and his plans will not be thwarted by the incursion of sin into the mix. So the ratio there of 1 to 2, it's a reflection of the broader themes. That though there is a rebellion against God, the rebellion does not circumvent God's plans. Although it does contradict them. And it does obviously defy them. So the form of the action, just like its structure, is designed to repair the fall of man. I just find that endlessly fascinating. Let's say you would take, when you're reading the poem, you would not pick this up, I don't think. There's no way you would. You would have to study it intently, as Mr. Fowler has. And when he lays it out, it's a pretty compelling case. There's another symbolism, similar. We're still talking about time here, which underlies the whole arrangement of how the action that's directly represented is ordered. So when Satan has his week of miscreation, oops, so let me put this back up. Which is, where is the week of miscreation? Days 24 to 31. Note that they range from midnight to midnight. Right in the dark. Comes out of the darkness. It is framed by the four remaining days. Days 23 and 24 and 32 and 33. And so the number 7 of mutability is contained or framed or structured by a tetrad, a so-called virtuous tetrad. So it's contained, so the 7 is contained by 4. You can look at Fowler for greater detail on that front, but comments or observations, questions? Did you follow what I said? That's just so much. I'm trying to tape it so you can go back and look at it, but I threw a lot. Do you want me to repeat it? Okay, I'll repeat it once more, but you still may not get it because there's a lot. Okay. So there's a pattern that reinforces the themes of the days and the time. It reinforces the themes. You got the themes. We talk about the themes all the time. That's the focus on the meaning of this and the narration of what happens. But in addition to the words and the themes, the numbers also say the same thing, because that's Milton's view. The 7 liberal arts, they all are testifying to a divinely ordered cosmos that all works in harmony. Everything holds together, and all things hold together in Christ. Colossians 1:16, I think. In him all things hold together. Well, he is the creator of them. Of course they do. And so it's not just the words and the people, it's everything. And they believe this. How much do they believe it? A lot more than we do. The people that advance knowledge more than any other, without any contradiction, or anyone that knows what they're talking about without contradiction, are Christians, because Christians believe that God created the world. He created it logically, and he created us to understand it. We're capable of understanding it, we're able to understand it, and it is right to understand it if it honors him. And so we can do what Milton said in his Treatise of Education. We can restore the ruins of our first parents by knowing God aright. And then he lays out his program of education, which to some degree is presented to us in miniature in the speech here of Raphael to Adam when he's talking about this. Adam is being schooled, more or less, in the way things are. He's a pupil. Some of you wrote essays on that, which is interesting. So, number symbolism. First of all, the terrestrial action occupies books 4 to 10. So it begins there with Adam and Eve in the garden for the first time in book 4, and that action carries all the way till book 10. Those are 7 books. The number 7 is the number of creation, also the number of the world. There are 7 days, remember, in Genesis 1. That number thereafter, the number 7, is of serious spiritual significance. It's not just that there are 7 days. 7 has a significance that we're going to see throughout Scripture in various ways. And there are books that are written on this. When I do the Bible as literature, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. I don't want to do it here today. But if you're with me for that, then we'll explore that a bit further. So that's the first point. Secondly, of these 7, the central day is, of course, the 4th day. There are 3 at the beginning, there are 3 at the end, and the 4th day is the central of those 7, and it is recounted in Book 7 of Paradise Lost. And in Book 7, it tells us of how things were all created. All things were created, and it discusses the system of the 7 planets, furthermore. It's a lot of 7s. That's the second point. The third point is that the 4th day, which is the central day, then, of the 7, which is day 17 of the 33, which is in the center of the 33 days. It's also the central book, Book 7. Like there are 2 halves of it, but 7 occupies the center of it in a way. So we get the account of heaven in 6, and earth and the war in heaven and so forth, but, right? On that 4th day, the sun is created. 4th point. And the sun occupies a central place in the created order. It's right in the center of it. The sun is in fact crowned. Again, the reference chapter or Book 7, line 386. We talk about crowning, but here it's almost literal. The sun is presented as almost like a sovereign. He's a symbol of Christ, who is the sovereign over all creation, but the sun is the sovereign of creation in terms of the constellations of the planets. Adam is the sovereign over the order of nature of Earth. Yes.
Okay, so sun is a play on words in the sense that it's the
Yeah,
sun
it's
isn't the actual sun, but at the same time, like, kind of symbolizes the Son of God.
Only in English. I mean, it doesn't in other languages,
Okay.
right?
Did it do it in the original?
Not Hebrew. It's not in Latin. None
No,
of those.
I mean like the version of English that Milton was using. I was going to say Middle English, but that's not right.
Yeah, he's not confused about it or anything like that. Yeah. So its sun just happens to sound like sun in English. It doesn't sound like it in Latin or Greek or Hebrew. So it's just incidental. Although maybe the reason we call it the sun, you might say, well, it's the same in German. So is it that the reason the Germans call it? Who knows? But you could speculate on that. People will do that. Well, why is this in Germanic languages that sun and sun, son and sana are the same thing? Or sound similar? Is that the reason? Who knows? But you could conjecture. And you would do so, if you did so, you'd do so with a little bit of merit. But whether that would be sufficient to explain it, that's another thing. So that's the 4th day. The sun occupies the central place in that day, and it is, as it were, the crown of the day is the sun. And as we know, all things grow with the influence of the sun and its light, which is a mirror image of all things operate in accordance with spiritual light, because God is that light. He's the light of the world, not the sun, as in the bright thing in the sky. Fifthly, the duration, this is a little bit tangentially, but I think still valuable, the duration of the directly represented terrestrial action, the action that takes place on the earth and it's directly represented, is only 11 days. So days 23 to 33 on this account, where Satan has a cosmic prospect and he's looking at or talking to Uriel at high noon. And so they're speaking at high noon, pops out, and Uriel, who is the sharpest sighted of all of God's angels, he can't spot the duplicity of Satan. But then it carries on. So those days are only 11. And why is 11 significant? Well, for the reason I said with Augustine. 11 represents or signifies the number of sin. Because the number 10 is the number of the law, and this is one more than that. 10 days, the number 10 of the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. There's one more. Number of sin. So there's there are 11 days of directly narrated terrestrial action. Well, that means that the ratio of directly narrated action, 11 days, to the whole of the action, so 11 directly represented, there are 22 days left. Those are just narrated by Milton. That ratio is 1 to 2, 11 to 22. And that ratio is also significant. What's the significance? It's the bookending, and it's the number of reason controlling sin. And the upshot of that is that the theme then, that the representation of the poem's action over 33 days seems to reinforce the idea that God orders things to repair mankind's fall, the fall of 11, the 22 bookending it, controlling it. Does that make sense? Even if it doesn't. I'm planning on putting it up online and we'll listen to it again. I've given a few of the passages to look at as well. So I want to repeat it again. Maybe I have to do it 3 times. Number 3 would be a good number, but we're not going to do that. So what's the thematic connection then? In books 10 and 11, or 10 to 12 rather, he discovers that God's judgment is just as certain and indubitable as mathematics. Cannot be disputed. To dispute it is to fall into contradiction, to be irrational. It's absolutely certain. He learns to say, with the psalmist, teach us to number our days. So that's how it concludes. It concludes with books 10 to 12, particularly of 11 and 12, are giving us an account of salvation history from the time of your offspring all the way up till the Son of God coming and repairing what you have marred, and then the account of the church, and afterwards the account of God's work in history. This is certain and you can trust it, and now your days should be numbered in accordance with how God reveals it. So trust him and teach us to number our days. So the poem's form leads to the very mount of God. And there's a sort of a divine transcendence over time, reigning over time. Which he sees there. So that's the reference to time. Comments, questions? I know it's a lot. I wondered whether I should present it. I still think I should, and I don't regret it, because I want you to see how important logic and order and structure is to the poem and to the mind. And when he talks about learning, he's not talking about opinion or speculation or people's feelings. Your feelings don't matter if they're false. They do matter, but don't tell me that your feelings are the central issue here. Because our feelings are just as disordered as our will and our reason is, for that matter. So reason needs to be directed rightly. He calls it right reason, by the way. Needs to be righted now that we're fallen. We can make errors in our logical reasoning. We say rationalize. We can rationalize actions. There's a logical train of events. We make a case for it, we persuade ourselves, we sometimes persuade others, it's nonetheless false. Okay? Got terrific response. Oh, go on. Yes, thank you.
I was going to say, what are your thoughts then on, like, say, Christian apologetics and stuff like that? The idea of trying to convince and reason through an argument to persuade an audience.
What are my thoughts on it? I think that we're supposed to do it. But I don't think that, so we're supposed to stop the mouths of scoffers. The purpose of apologetics is not to persuade people to become Christians, because that becomes then a rational exercise, suggesting that a person can come to faith without the work of God. But that doesn't mean that we're not supposed to remove the impediments to it, and sometimes those are intellectual impediments. So it's to stop the mouth of scoffers, so to defend the church against the slanders of the enemy that the Christian faith is illogical and irrational and a crux for emotionally crippled people or something like that, of which when you're around Christians often enough you think, well, there's a case there. There's a lot of damage in the church. A lot of people are walking wounded. They admit it, at least, so that's good. But that's the case that's being made. Well, apologetics is there as presenting a reasoned defense of what is entirely rationally defensible, and it shuts them up. And it defends Christians who believe that their faith is real and true, but can't do it themselves. So it strengthens their convictions. So I think apologetics is essential. It's not the same as evangelism, although it goes with it. So I think there are various forms of apologetics, types of apologetics, schools of apologetics, and all of them have some use. But there was certainly a trend at one point in evangelicalism, as far as I understand it. I remember I'm an adult convert, so I don't speak as somebody who grew up in all this. There was a trend at one point to disparage apologetics. Perhaps because they recognize the rationalism, but and maybe the false assumption that we can just, if you just give enough good reasons to people, they'll become believers, which is just nonsense. It's pure nonsense. I've been in those conversations over the years, and people almost never have a rational objection to the faith anyway. They present rational objections, and once you deal with them, then they bring out the real objection, which is they don't like it, or they don't like the implications for their life. That means I'm going to have to stop living the way I live, or it means that I feel like I'm being condemned by what you say. So there's the real thing. They suppress the truth and unrighteousness. They don't want to hear it, but that's because they're angry, and some of them are a little bit more clever, and so they'll present it as a rational objection. Well, once you kick that away, now you're left with the person that's really angry at you, and that's the real objection. Okay, that's good. You're not going to be thanked for it by the person, other than if they were deceiving themselves, which they do. People deceive themselves. Okay, I've had that kicked away. What's left? My anger about the fact that my mother died, or somebody has cancer, or that I can't live my life the way I want, have sex with whom I want, whatever. All those sorts of things. Those are the real motivations. I want to sin. Or I'm angry about something. Fair enough. So there's my answer. And so Milton is not presenting this apologetically per se. That's not his intent, but I think actually when you look at it, it has a sort of an apologetic force for me now, interestingly. And again, I think that, and I've said repeatedly that I think music has an apologetic force. It's a beautiful and orderly and in many ways persuasive to the affections account of the truth and goodness of God. Everyone's moved by music. But if their feelings are moved along with their minds and their sense of right and wrong, this is a wonderful thing. But it's one of the 7 liberal arts, so hardly to be surprised. There are different ways of doing it. Music is not the least. Neither is poetry. Poetry, as Milton's presenting, by the way, is rhetoric. So it's the crown of the logic, the crown of the linguistic forms of the liberal arts. And your subject, English literature, is what the ancients would have called rhetoric. I'm a teacher of rhetoric, actually, in some ways. Remember, Augustine was too, and he didn't think much of it. But that was ancient rhetoric, not the Christianized version of it. Not that there aren't problems with it. At any rate, so that's space and the astronomy then. So if God contains light and darkness, but also transcends them with the time they divide, because remember, time is divided by light and darkness. He also does the same thing in relation to space. Book 3, verse 58 says that God is high, throned above all height. Like, try and picture that. Well, you can't. Above all height. While the spatial universe, the one that can be measured, is mysteriously imagined as the vehicle for his Son to reign in. And one day he'll put all things under his feet. And it's described in spatial terms. So he's above all height, the Father on the one hand. The Son is presented as the working of the Father in relation to the created order. And so he is, and creation is then the vehicle for the Son's reign. The central image of the poem is of the chariot triumphantly led by angels, cherubs, that form his throne. So book 6, lines 749 to 759. That is the central image of the poem in book 7. Or 6, rather. Sorry. Not 7, 6. In heaven. We were just there. About the center of his throne are 10,000 beings that are angels that acknowledge his sovereignty. They're forever praising him. 10,000. 10,000, they're not literally 10,000. It's a number beyond all counting. The Bible will use that as the number that surpasses number. And they acknowledge his sovereignty. Now, sometimes angels are presented as stars. Right? The 7 stars in the book of Revelation are often understood as the angels. The 7, by the way, again representing a number of earthly completeness, or the number of creation. Or in that case, the 7 churches, and the 7 churches represent all the churches in that day. So again, the numerological significance is thematically significant, just like the book of Revelation needs to really be read this way. So they are surrounding his throne, they acknowledge his sovereignty, and the stars are associated, sometimes figuratively, sometimes literally, with angels. So in book 3, line 622 and 700 to 716, let me just read that. So book 3, line 700. I'll read that to you. I can get there. 700. To witness with thine eyes what some perhaps contented with report here only in heaven. For wonderful indeed are all his works, pleasant to know and worthiest to be all, had in remembrance always with delight. But what created mind can comprehend their number, or the wisdom infinite that brought them forth, but hid their causes deep? I saw when at his word, the formless mass, this world's material mold came to a heap, confusion heard his voice, and wild uproar stood vast infinitude confined, till at his second bidding darkness fled. Light shone and order from disorder sprung. Swift to their several quarters hasted then the cumbrous elements, earth, flood, air, fire. And this ethereal quintessence of heaven flew upward, spirited with various forms that rolled orbicular and turned to stars numberless as thou seest, and how they move. Each had his place appointed, each his course, the rest in circuit walls, this universe. So there's the stars presented as stars. Elsewhere they're presented as the angels. And the angels are, which one's symbolic of the other, you can depend on. Depends how you want to see the symbolism. Do the stars symbolize the angels, or the angels symbolize the stars? And these stars or angels perform a choresis, a divine dance, a starry dance. Book 3, line 580, it speaks of this. I will read that, line 580. But they, as they move their starry dance in numbers that compute days, months, and years towards his all-cheering lamp. So the stars mark the years. And there's a dance, which is a celebration, a joyous celebration of God's beneficent sovereignty, which is marked not only by the angels, but the whole of the created order. Everything bespeaks the glory and majesty of God. Not only beings, but everything. So Milton's astronomical world represents the idea that the material world is like a great machine that exalts Christ. If you didn't praise me, the stones themselves would have cried out. The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies showeth forth his handiwork. And they pour out speech and so forth, right? The psalmist says. Day after day, night after night. Biblical support for the idea. By the way, there's always biblical support for the idea. It's not speculative. Or imposing a metaphysics on the Bible. The Bible is undergirding the metaphysics that develops. And this is very similar to, if you ever want to read of Platos Timaeus. The universe is almost alive. In Plato, there's a sort of a paganism there, an animate universe. It's like a breathing cosmos, motivated in Plato's Timaeus by love, interestingly. So Timaeus was very popular with Neoplatonists, Christian Neoplatonists. They saw a strong overlap in the ideas that are presented in Scripture of Christian theology and in what Plato is saying about the way that love orders the cosmos. And when we say the cosmos, we don't just mean people, but every little blessed thing. And all of it is offering prayer to God. And the one thing that doesn't are people. And they're called to repent. So in other words, everything in it, one of the charges that T.S. Eliot made of Milton is that Milton lacked a spatial imagination. He has a theological sense, but he doesn't really have a sense of space. He doesn't present it in a way that we can see the images. I think he's entirely wrong on this, although you could at least excuse him because Milton's spatial imagination isn't talking about empirically observable. He is in terms of the language of empiricism, he's talking about the language of the old scientific language of a rationally visible universe. And Milton is, make no mistake, fascinated with astronomy. His whole audience, and all of his contemporaries are as well. And Milton goes and visits Galileo, and he mentions Galileo multiple times in Paradise Lost. For Milton, Galileo is a prisoner of conscience, represents the freedom, truth-loving individual who is unjustly imprisoned. It's a martyr for the truth. So all the details, when you hear the details of day and morning and the constellations, they are actually significant to Milton. They're not incidental. Never. If you're like me, you probably skip over them. Say, oh, it's just too much. You would have to have a critic do what Mr. Fowler has done and lay it out for you. This is how it works, because it's too much. But that there is an order, that is clear. So when Satan leaves the earth, an illustration, he leaves the earth after the fall. You can look this up, book 10, lines 328 to 329. We're told, betwixt the centaur and the scorpion steering his zenith, while the sun in Aries rose. You might just say, well, this is a wonderful image. He's between the scorpion on the, and the Sagittarius, the huntsman. Okay. And between them is a serpent. But between those, I'm reading directly from Fowler here, because I would never know this. I would never know this. The point between Sagittarius and Scorpio will be between 120 degrees and 150 degrees from Aries, and this will mean that if the zenith at Paradise is at that point, then the time must be between 2 and 4 a.m. Who cares? Well, the day of judgment after the fall, that the day that's repeatedly postponed, now it comes. So it's still within that day. Now it's happened. Fowler's comment is that representation so detailed may easily arouse false expectations of continuous novelistic realism. So in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the monster read Paradise Lost as true history, for instance. I have to admit, when I read it as an undergraduate, I had the sense, it seems so detailed and so precise, it's almost like a novel. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, as if you were an eyewitness and you're recording every detail. But that's not quite what he's doing. It's a Renaissance realism. So it's an exemplary and local and discontinuous realism. So it's happened there, but it doesn't mean it happens everywhere at all times, and we can't really track it in that sense. But it is in his mind that it happens, and he portrays it in a very clear and coherent way. By the way, the sun will not always rise in Aries. It will get changed after that. That's another point. It's a consequence of the fall. This will never happen again with the same regularity that it has up to this point. There are various views, so let me talk about cosmology briefly. There are various views of cosmology in Milton's day. You know two of them, I think, or at least if you've taken my classes you do, because I've talked about the Ptolemaic cosmology. You want me to put one up on the board here? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? If not, I'll stick it up here. I'll stick it up anyway, even if you do know. I don't even know what this one is. Oops. One more. Let's go with this one. We usually go with this one. There we go. This is the Ptolemaic cosmology. The Earth is in the center. You can see the water and the Earth together, and above them, the air, and above them, fire. And above that, there's a sort of the ether. So the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And the fire is like around the air. There's a light that's presented as fire, and we can see instances of it on Earth as well. Things catch on fire as they get lighter, and like things that are dry catch fire because everything's composed of theyese four elements. So they're there. And then above that is the lunae, the moon, and then Mercury and Venus and the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And you can see that there are 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. These are the 7 planets, the 7 liberal arts named after them. And then the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th spheres, the 8th and the 9th and the 10th heaven, represent the starry firmament and and then outside that all the prima mobile, the one that moves them all. And it moves them all in a sort of, again, a celestial dance. So there's a movement, and the planets move. One planet moves, let's say, clockwise, and the other moves counterclockwise, just to use an analogy. And as the planets go by one another, there's an oscillation that takes place, a vibration, which creates a music, the music of the spheres. And the music there is the music, and I talked about this when we were speaking on the eve of the morning of Christ's Nativity, makes the music of the spheres, which is inaudible to human ears, but it matches what we call the musica instrumenta, the 8 notes of the, oh, by the way, the 8th note. The 8th note is not a contradiction of sin, it's the heavenly. So the number 8, go look up the number 8 and the theological significance of the number 8. It's not like 11. 11's the number of sin, 8's almost the opposite. And outside that, the caelum imperium habitaculum Dei et omnium electorum is the heavenly realm, the habitation of God and all the elect, all the saints. It's presented as outside that. So that's the Ptolemaic cosmology. So God's not within that, nor is heaven. It's sort of outside of it. It's hard to visualize. In fact, it's not meant to be visualized per se. Don't think of empiricist senses. God is outside because, again, he's outside space and time. So to think of him in terms of a temporal location up there on his throne, which is the language that's accommodationist language, is just to speak of his height above all heights. And Lewis will use this cosmology in his Narnia Chronicles, and furthermore in his Space Trilogy. So you'll go up, 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 but you'll also go in, further up and further in, because we are outside the place where the real center of the cosmos is, which is God himself. When we say that, he's outside space and time. So where is he? Well, don't think of him in space and time. He's everywhere. It's just, we think in terms of space and time. So again, God accommodates to us and we understand in accordance with space and time. That's just the way we are. We're created beings. We operate that way. But God himself, although he creates it, and certainly the mark of his reign is in that, that doesn't mean that he is a being like we are. Even though we bear the image of God, God doesn't have hands and feet and so forth. You can speak of God as a he, but that doesn't mean he is masculine in the very same sense that I am. It's a picture, right? And a man and a woman is a picture or an image of Christ in the church. All those things. So it's an analogy. So that's the one cosmology. The other one is more familiar. So this is the geocentric one, Earth at the center. It's not moving. We talk about the sun rising, the sun setting. It's moving around the planet. And the moon waxes and it wanes. And all of these spheres influence one another. So the moon, in its full moon phase, it pulls the water up towards it. So we'll see that the tides will be moved by the cycles of the moon. And we will find that creatures are affected by this other as well. People notice that in the time of a full moon, people are under the influence of the moon. They're lunatics, is the word. They're under lunae. It's a lunacy. But everything, and so they will say, we can observe it there with the closest planet, but can we note it with the other one? The answer is yes, but it's less obvious. And then that hence the importance of astronomy and so forth. Unusual constellations, because they think that there is an influence. By the way, astronomy is not astrology, and when we say influence, it doesn't mean determinism. It's not a fatalistic universe, because God remembers outside space and time and works through love, not coercion or compulsion, whereas the laws of physics are coercive and compulsive. Jump out the window and try it out. Actually, I didn't say that. Gravity doesn't, you can't do Bugs Bunny and say, I never studied law, so the law of gravity doesn't apply. Because he's walking out. Bugs, never mind. Why doesn't he fall like Wile E. Coyote? Because he never studied law. Never mind. So that's the one. Then there's the heliocentric, which is the one that is commonly accepted in our day, in which the sun is the center of what we would call the solar system, and in which the Earth is revolving on its axis and it is moving around the planet, or around the sun rather, and then we called it a year. There are 365 days and a bit. That constitutes a solar year. There's that. Milton's aware of both of them, by the way. What Milton presents, however, is, and then there's another one by Tycho Brahe at the time, and I'm not even going to deal with that. Milton presents his own cosmology here, bizarrely, which is a fusion of the geocentric and the heliocentric cosmology, because remember, he's presenting the cosmos before the fall. Now there's disjuncture. Back then, there was a sort of a consonance between every last thing. So the geometry of Milton's invented, unfallen world is very simple. Day and night are always equal. The days don't get longer in the summer and shorter in the winter. They're always the same. The sun is always in the same sign in the zodiac. There's no change. It's perfect. It's an unfallen world. The constellations can easily be determined without some sort of chart or an astrolabe or something like that. You need to have a chart of the time of the year and different seasons and the years change and all that. That's a consequence of the fall, says Milton. Milton says before all of that, the sun is always here, the days are exactly the same length, the night, etc., etc. So it's a fictional world that he presents. And in it, both Ptolemaic and Copernican understandings of astronomy seem acceptable. There's a sort of a fusion of them. So it's his own invention. Now, why does he do this? Is the final question. At least my final question. I think he wants to, I agree with Fowler on this, or at least it seems sensible to me. He wants to present the astronomical controversy of his day, which was hugely controversial. As I say, Galileo was under house arrest. People are being executed for their views of astronomy because they contradict church teaching. And so what about church teaching? It's not just church teaching. It's the fact that they're undermining the view of knowledge in the universe. And so people are getting thrown into great discord and uncertainty. And with that, then there's a great resurgence in the church of what happens on occasion. People think that the end of the world is coming. Because there's a great disruption even amongst those who are in positions of power and authority. Whenever that happens, there's a sense of chaos that's broken out. We live in that in our own day. If you have a feeling that there's nobody watching you, and that there's no order, and that you can do whatever is right in your own eyes, this is a dangerous place. They see this in their world, and there are millenarian views that are very popular in this day. The end of the world is nigh. So Milton uses this to symbolize that inquiry in general. So he uses books 7 and 8, in which he presents these various cosmologies, to talk about a reasoned inquiry of astronomy, and it's not a bad thing. So he doesn't say forget about all that, which he could have, I guess, and left it outside the consideration of the epic, although then he wouldn't really serve the encyclopedic purposes of the epic, which is one of the marks of the epic. Everything that can be known is presented in some way, so it is being presented. So he symbolizes Adam's interest as a good thing to know. It's a good thing to understand the world around you. Nothing wrong with that. But there are limitations to that knowledge, and one of the limitations is that it's even before the fall, it defies the archangel's capacities to explain it exhaustively to him, or it's presented in a way that there are limitations to it. So Galileo, as I say, is a martyr for intellectual freedom. He keeps open both the geocentric and the heliocentric are both possibilities when you read this. So his modern Adam, that is his own contemporaries, and we could include us under this, I guess, might be at the point of recognizing that the Ptolemaic system is just not it's just not adequate. But that doesn't mean you have to let it go. There's something true in it. There's also something clearly true in the Copernican view. There's something true about that as well. How do we hold these two things in tension? We don't jettison one and keep the other. You hold on to both of them. And that's characteristic, by the way, of 17th century thought in general. They don't throw anything out. All truth is God's truth. This can't be so the one model can't be entirely correct, but there are aspects of both that seem correct. Let's hold on to that. And by holding on to both of the systems, he is effectively saying that he is relating the fall to the cultural developments of his own day, that is, the discoveries by Galileo about how the old cosmology can't possibly be true as it has been presented. Can't possibly be. Have a look for yourself, Milton. Look through the telescope, you can see. And in the end, the angel says to Adam, but that's enough, and there are more important things to know. And so there's also a sense of, with knowledge comes some uncertainty. You might be better off with a simple happiness. And confine yourself to obeying God and loving Him. Not that this is wrong, but your new knowledge is not going to make you a more contented, godly man. So I'm going to finish with a quotation from Fowler, and then we might finish it a few seconds early. The universe of Paradise Lost is a visionary, perfected universe. With striking originality, Milton has constructed an entire fictive astronomy based on a premise untrue for the present world. His premise that the ecliptic and equatorial planes coincide has not been true since the fall. So he has to work out its implications with ingenuity reminiscent of science fiction. Like Plato and Augustine, Milton believes creation is by number and measure. And now he quotes Galileo. This grand book, the universe, the book of nature, as it's often called, this is Galileo's phrase, this grand book, the universe, is written in the language of mathematics, says Galileo. The geometry of Milton's invented unfallen world is elegantly simple and exhilaratingly easy to visualize. Its day and night are always equal. Its sun remains constantly in the same sign, and the positions of its constellations are easily determined without astrolabe or planisphere. There are no variations in solar declination, no equinoctial points, no precession, no difference between sidereal, natural, and civil days. All the days are the same. However you measure them, there's no change. They're all the same. This lucid, rational world can be seen as figuring a simple innocence now lost. So the consequences of the fall is that the prelapsarian golden age stasis changes to crooked movements. Now everything is chaotic and moving in a way that doesn't quite match up in the same way. So knowledge will never be the same. Even if you seek to recover Adamic knowledge, you're not going to do it in the same way because the whole cosmos has changed. It's broken. It won't be healed until Christ returns and restores all things. So it's not going to happen. Remember, the new heaven and the new earth will come down from God. It can't be brought up to God by human knowledge. So you can't fix what has been broken by sin, but God can do it, and he will one day. That's how Milton presents it. Okay? Interesting? Yeah? It's interesting. Okay.